Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to ReFED's Food Waste Action Network's very first Lunch and Learn. My name is Angel Bessa, and I am the Capital Innovation and Engagement Senior Manager here at ReFED. I am seeing a lot of familiar faces familiar names in the room today. It's really great that you guys could be here. I'm also seeing some new members of the network, so welcome. We're really thrilled that you're able to join us today. We're excited to be kicking things off with a topic that many Food Waste Action Network members have expressed interest in: food waste and policy. We'll spend the first half of today's Lunch and Learn really hearing a couple of short presentations that dive into specific policies and the role different agencies play in implementing federal policies as it pertains to reducing wasted food. For just a moment, I'm going to ask that everyone please mute themselves. We're getting a little bit of background noise and would like to be able to minimize that as much as possible. Great, thank you. And as I was saying, after we have these short presentations, we'll jump into a really nice, interesting fireside chat moderated by ReFED's Executive Director, Dana Gunders. And before we dive in, let's just take a quick moment to talk about the role policy plays in our work. So while policymakers are not waste generators, they still play a really important role in food waste reduction by enacting policies that can accelerate the adoption of solutions at a large scale. In recent years, policymakers have established pre-competitive business standards, driven sector-wide action, removed barriers to solutions implementation, provided financing to help overcome the stumbling block of misaligned incentives, and much more. And though the characteristics of each policy and the extent to which they promote or impede food waste reduction efforts vary significantly, by incentivizing good practices and clarifying what activities are allowed, each has the power to provide a spark that can move the food system to action, which is why ReFED has identified policy as one of the 4 key levers that can facilitate the implementation and scaling of food waste reduction solutions. Now, to learn more about the other levers ReFED's identified, check out that link that's coming through in the chat now from my colleague Alejandro. Great, so now as we'll hear today, policy and regulation are especially effective in overcoming challenges where there are misaligned incentives between who is funding a solution and who is receiving the benefit. And through our work, we've identified some key policy actions that can drive impact, such as disincentivizing, limiting, or banning food from landfills through policies like the newly introduced Zero Food Waste Act and Compost Act. Speaking of which, I'd like to take a quick moment and just see how many people on the line today have heard of the Zero Food Waste Action Act and Compost Act. Feel free to just send through and chat and kind of want to get a pulse on where everyone's at today. Nice. All right. Okay, awesome. I'm seeing a mix of people who've heard about it. People are here to learn more today. We're going to be talking about a variety of other aspects of food waste and policy, so I'm confident that we're all going to be walking away with a new insight and learning. So now, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our presenters. First up, joining us today is Ariel Ardura. She is the Senior Clinical Fellow at the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic. Ariel received her Doctor of Law from Georgetown, where she gained a range of experience in food and health law and policy through internships and work with the DC Food Policy Director, USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, and as the Emily Spitzer intern for the National Health Law Program. We're also very excited to have Kevin Smith, Senior Advisor at the FDA Office of Food Safety, joining us. As a senior advisor in the FDA's Office of Food Safety, Kevin advises FDA leadership on strategic initiatives and program development related to FDA's food safety mission. Kevin has been leading FDA's efforts on food waste and recovery and served as a member of the expert panel for the ReFED Food Recovery Accelerator. Kevin's also held several leadership positions at FDA, including director of the Retail Food Protection Staff, and currently co-leads the implementation of the Sanitary Transportation of Foods Rule. We're really lucky to have these two stellar experts. And with that, I'd like to welcome Ariel Ardura onto the screen. I think she's coming on.
Hi. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
There you are. Thanks for joining us today. We're really, really happy to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. It's really great to be here with everyone.
Great. Well, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Awesome. I will go ahead and share my screen. Give me just a second. Okay. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So I guess I'll go back a sec. As Angel said, my name is Ariel Ardura, and I am a senior clinical fellow and attorney with the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School. So just really briefly about the clinic, we provide legal and policy advice to nonprofits, government agencies, entrepreneurs, and other organizations on a whole range of food systems policy questions. So we're sort of like a small nonprofit policy institute in that sense. And then we also, we're a clinic at the law school. So because of that, our role is also to teach students about these food systems issues in the classroom, and then work with them on clinic projects to help bring awareness to these issues, develop solutions, provide resources to our clients and partner organizations. We work across several areas in the clinic, which you can see from this circle here. And reducing food waste and recovering food happens to be our oldest area of work and one of our biggest. So Angel just gave a very excellent overview of the role of policy in sort of food waste and food recovery. So I won't really go into that, but I'll just say, these are some of the specific issue areas that we work on at the clinic here. Okay. And as Angel also mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Zero Food Waste Act and the Compost Act today. So I'm going to start by telling you all a little bit about those. I'll try not to get into too much detail because we do also have David Schutt from Representative Brownley's office on the call, and he's kind of the main drafter of these bills. Okay, so we'll start with the Zero Food Waste Act. This was introduced this July, and what it would do is establish an EPA program to award competitive grants to state, tribal, and local governments that would support the development of policies, programs, and infrastructure to prevent, measure, and recycle food waste in 3 key areas. And I forgot to mention that this was in the House, it was introduced by Representative Brownley, and in the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Booker. So the grant funding under this bill could go toward reduction roadmaps, which would study local sources of food waste, develop reduction policies and programs, and create a plan for regular food waste measurement. Funding could go towards food waste mitigation projects. These projects could do any number of things. They could implement new policies aimed at preventing food waste and rescuing safe and edible food. They could disincentivize the landfilling and incineration of food waste. They could incentivize composting and food recycling. And they could also create new markets and demand for compost, or any other projects that enable food waste prevention, rescue, or recycling. And then finally, the grant funding could go towards the measurement of food waste over time to help enable governments to better identify, prevent, and manage food waste, and measure the results for people, nature, and climate. So the bill would provide $650 million per year in funding for the program through 2030. And then we have the Compost Act. which was also introduced by Representative Brownley and Senator Booker and introduced at the same time in July. Its full name is the Cultivating Organic Matter Through the Promotion of Sustainable Techniques Act. So a bit of a mouthful. But one thing it would do is, so USDA has designated certain activities as conservation practices. And so this bill would add composting as a conservation practice for USDA conservation programs. And then it would also establish a USDA-led municipal and community composting infrastructure grant and loan guarantee program to fund projects like new facility construction or equipment purchases and organic waste collection programs. And this bill would provide $250 million in annual funding through 2030. So those are, two really awesome bills that we, FLPC is super supportive of. And I'll tell you a few key differences between the bills that sort of highlight the importance of both bills. So the Zero Food Waste Act provides cities and states with flexibility beyond composting infrastructure. So it can go towards things like food rescue infrastructure, food measurement, et cetera. And then it can also be used to fund food waste policy, planning and measurement. And then the Zero Food Waste Act really focuses heavily on food waste prevention and measurement to serve as the foundation of any proposed food waste reduction plan, policy, or infrastructure, like composting. And then there are a number of synergies between the two bills. So the planning and measurement can really underpin effective community and commercial composting infrastructure design. Also would provide cities and states with the funds to develop the proper food waste policies, or composting demand stimulation will help to generate a greater demand for composting infrastructure. And both bills work to prioritize underserved communities, and especially those that demonstrate they've been disproportionately affected by environmental and public health harms. So I won't get into the bills anymore. I'll kind of leave that to David during our chat later. But you might have been wondering, when I was talking about the Zero Food Waste Act, what sorts of food waste mitigation projects could the funding go towards? And so I want to just talk through a few examples now. And these are by no means exhaustive. They're just policies that we've actually seen implemented in different states and localities. They sort of provide a model for what other state, tribal, and local governments could be doing with this sort of funding. So the first is organic waste bans and waste recycling laws. So you may know that over 97% of food waste ends up in landfills, and then that food waste produces large amounts of methane and about 135 million tons of greenhouse gases each year. And so one really critical solution is organic waste bans and waste recycling laws. Organic waste bans ban certain entities from sending their waste to landfills. The government that implements them doesn't say what these entities have to do with their waste. They just say it can't go to the landfill, and then the entity itself determines some alternative action like composting it or donating it or something like that. And we've seen these implemented in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont. And then waste recycling laws are a little bit different. They require entities to take a specific action with their waste. So the law might say, these entities have to compost their waste or send it to an anaerobic digester or donate it. But what they both do is prohibit certain entities that generate specified amounts of food waste from sending waste to landfills. And we've seen 5 states and DC that have implemented state level waste bans and recycling laws. So that's one thing that funding could go towards. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next thing, which is date labels. So date labels are generally suggestions of peak quality and don't have anything to do with safety, but most consumers, about 90%, think that date labels are safety related. And at least 84% of consumers at least occasionally discard food close to or past its label date. And what's, complicates the issue is that there's no federal definition or requirement for expiration dates. So FDA only requires date labels on infant formula, and they recommend the use of the term best if used by to indicate quality concerns, but they don't require that. And USDA also recommends the use of the term best if used by to indicate quality concerns, but again, they don't require it. And so one really important solution is date label education campaigns, which help to educate consumers and businesses about what date labels actually mean. And we've seen states like Connecticut do this. So that's one thing that funding could go towards through this grant program. And I think I'm at time. I'm not sure if I've gotten any notes from the folks at ReFED, but I guess I'll just really quickly move to the next slide and say that another big area where we've seen a lot of state and local action is in food waste reduction in K through 12 schools. So funding could go toward these sorts of efforts to create like food donation programs in schools or composting programs or things like that. And with that, I will stop there, and I'm really excited now to hand it off to Kevin.
Good afternoon or good morning to folks out there. It's a pleasure to be here and I appreciate the invitation from my friends at ReFED to be able to chat with you a little bit about food safety policy. I'm going to share my screen and hope it can. All right, let's see. Oh no, let's see. Why is that not sharing? How's that? All right, can you see my screen? Hopefully.
Looks good, Kevin.
Good. Okay, great. So it's interesting to be here to talk a little bit about how federal agency policy can impact food loss and waste. I'm sitting here from FDA, but the perspectives that Ariel shared and that you'll hear later perhaps could be more easily explained by folks at USDA and EPA, who are more the lead agencies and have a better position to incentivize food waste reduction. It's as FDA was invited into the mix. It's almost as how can FDA's mission of food safety and improve nutrition, how does that interface with food waste reduction efforts, and how can we not get in the way while also fulfilling the missions that are laid out in our congressional mandates and the congressional acts by which our mission is defined. So I'm just going to try to give you it's too much to cover in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to give you just a little flavor for how food waste and food loss and waste interfaces with our mission and some of our specific activities, and describe, of course, how we work with our partners and the key players in the space to try to help provide solutions. I won't get into a lot of detail, but about the impacts of food loss and waste in the US, I think everyone has a pretty good feel for it. But of course, the massive economic, environmental, and social costs of excess food waste is it's a big problem. And one of the challenges for me is kind of, as I've got to learn more about it, is helping educate FDA leadership and our field personnel on why it's important to pay attention to food waste, even though it's not specifically mentioned in our mission statement, nor is it part of our broad strategic plans. But that's starting to change. We recognize you can't operate in a silo and expect food systems to function properly if we're not all working together. Of course, how in general, what role can government play on the global scale? Of course, we are trying to be a good, the U.S. federal government has to be a leader in obtaining global goals for reducing food waste. And that's kind of what prompted the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. 50% reduction in food loss and waste goal kind of got things moving for the U.S. government. And in 2015, the U.S. announced the first national waste reduction goal, again, 50% reduction by 2030. That was an EPA and USDA spearheaded effort. FDA was invited to join along in 2016, and I was excited after working a lot of years in our retail food protection program. I was excited to kind of spearhead that effort for FDA, and it's been quite a challenge. But you know, the national, it's great that Ariel covered so much about what can happen through legislation, but including with tax incentives. How do you engage industry to kind of bring along best practices for reducing food waste? Those are, you know, federal leadership is important in that area. Of course, what really, I'm always, even in my food safety work, I've always been an advocate for state and local authorities that are really in the best position to incentivize particular action, whether it's industry or consumers or not-for-profits. So there's all, you know, and you heard Ariel cover a little bit about landfill bans, and we know that state and local agencies have a lot to do with food recovery and donation policies. Again, also tax incentives. I kind of point to I think it's very exciting that there's things like the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which brings state on the West Coast, the state leaders, state local leaders, and the industry together to kind of explore what are the best options. So those are very exciting work at the state and local level. So knowing that this was going to be a big effort in the federal government, we established an interagency collaboration to kind of work together. So USDA, FDA, and EPA, we announced a formal agreement in 2018 to work together. That prompted the announcement of a Winning on Reducing Food Waste initiative that was announced in 2019. And then it's been pretty successful. We think it's, you know, things take time, but there was enough interest and progress being seen that we announced that we're renewing a new 3-year agreement, formal agreement between the 3 agencies in December of last year to continue our work. Part of that work was to kind of say, okay, what should we be focusing on? We established a strategic plan that identified what areas we need to work on. One is, of course, how do we integrate, how do different government agencies work together to do this? It's not just us, the 3 agencies I've mentioned, but we're also attempting to work with a lot of other Department of Energy and the IRS and the Government Service Administration, GSA, to kind of drive these priorities. We know there's a big focus on consumer education and outreach, as well as measurement of food loss and waste. Those are big priorities more for USDA. They're kind of the lead on the measurement, as well as EPA. Clarify and communicate information on food safety and date labels, food donations, the liability protections associated with the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act, things like that. We know that's important. FDA has an important role in there. And that's kind of where we're focusing a lot of our energy. We also know we have to collaborate with private industry to reduce food loss across the entire supply chain. And we have to take a close look at our own federal facilities where we operate. There's a lot of food service in federal facilities, not to mention the Department of Defense. So we're looking at how we can make sure the government themselves, the operations facilities we operate, are doing their best to reduce food waste. I really, it's been such a pleasure. Such talented people at EPA and USDA working on reducing food waste. So here's just some of the stuff that EPA and USDA are involved with. The EPA's call to action report kind of set the stage for what we need to try to do as a federal government and what everyone can do to reduce food waste. And then those two agencies are in a better position to incentivize innovation as well as practices that across the supply chain that can reduce food waste. Incentivizing anaerobic digestion is a good example. EPA has done a lot to try to keep food that surplus food that doesn't go to humans or animals out of the landfills at least. And so they have a lot of exciting incentives through grants and stuff to do that. USDA was good in the Farm Bill. Like there's not a lot of federal legislation that speaks specifically to food waste, but the Farm Bill in 2018 did create a food waste liaison position that's been filled by Dr. Jean Busby, and she's been doing all sorts of good things to outreach to kind of spread the word of what USDA is doing to try to reduce food waste. That she's housed in the office of the chief economist, but of course there's a lot of other the USDA is huge, and there's lots of parts of the agency that can do good things. Jean has spearheaded a lot of webinars and educational blogs, innovation fairs. There's a roundtable that will be taking place on September 15th that I hope everyone on this call will be able to participate in. That will be announced shortly, and how to participate in that. So keep your eyes open for that. Another example of where USDA is showing leadership here is in the FSIS, which is the kind of the FDA equivalent in some ways of the USDA pieces. Food Safety Inspection Service deals with food safety. They issued a draft guideline to assist the donation of meat and poultry products to nonprofits last December. That's had a long comment period. They are working on the final guidelines now, and hopefully those will come out soon. That will give people a little more meat and poultry operations that are regulated by USDA. It will give them a little more direction on how to do it safely. Of course, they also incentivize research and measurement as well, as I mentioned. So how does it now? How about FDA? How does food waste initiatives interface with our mission? We're a regulatory agency at heart. That's the way we're required to keep food as safe as it possibly can and give consumers information about what they're eating. So obviously that can have an impact on how food's labeled. What are the food safety requirements for food that is sold in interstate commerce, and what is appropriate for diversion of surplus foods to animal food? How do you keep animals safe when they're fed excess or surplus food? Also, we're a public health agency, so addressing food insecurity is an interesting interface where our mission isn't heavily based in how to make sure people get enough food, but there's certainly we can play a leadership role there, and we want to encourage access to nutritious foods. It's not going to do us a lot of good if we're not focused on the nutrition that is that's associated with foods that are donated for people in need. And a consumer protection agency. We know FDA is looked to for advice. Consumers look to FDA for sound advice. So what can we advise folks on how to protect their families while also doing their part to not waste food unnecessarily? That's a big challenge as well. All right, so I thought I was going to I want to give you just a little feel of how FDA regulates the food supply. And you folks are probably familiar perhaps with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's the regulate rules that were established in the early 1900s and throughout the first half of the 1900s to regulate the food supply. What if someone is going to sell food in interstate commerce? What are they required to do to ensure it's safe, doesn't cause foodborne illness and injury? The act worked fairly well, but there was just still too many outbreaks associated with foods that FDA regulates. So Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2011, which prompted wanted to create a more preventive approach, requiring that companies that are involved in the manufacture, packing, holding of food are doing all they can to prevent foodborne illness. So that requires us, that the act required us to establish standards or regulations for a whole range of industry sectors across the entire supply chain, all the way from just, manufacturing, production, retail, and then we of course have the task of enforcing those rules. And so we have to make sure our folks understand how to enforce those regulations. Just a quick feel, there's 7 foundational rules that emerged from FSMA. FSMA required FDA to develop regulations for all sorts of things, and the big one, preventive controls for human food and preventive controls for animal food. That again kind of reinforced the concept that firms have to take steps. They have to identify the hazards that might be associated with the food they're producing and or distributing, and what controls do they have to have in place. Produce safety rule is also a big one. That's the first time that there was regulations developed for on-farm practices. That rule is still in its process of being implemented. There's a lot of guidance that has been published, more guidance to come. In fact, about the water used on farms, about the hygiene of folks who are involved in harvesting food from farms, and what kind of soil amendments are used. It's a very wide scoped rule. Also, some other ones there: foreign supplier verification. We have to focus on imports. How do we know that imports are as safe as the food being produced here? Third-party accreditation. That's recognizing that folks have that private sector third-party standards can play an important role, not just federal regulation, but and inspection and audits of firms across the globe is an important tool. As sanitary transportation is another one, making sure that food isn't getting contaminated while it's being transported, and then how to prevent intentional adulteration, how do you prevent folks from either adulterating food for economic gain or for nefarious purposes.
Kevin, so this is really great.
Running out of time?
We're running a little bit out of time. We're getting lots of great questions though.
Right. Yeah, I will, I know it's probably too much. I'll point people to the New Era on Smarter Food Safety. That's there's key elements that's announced over a year ago to say, hey, we got to be a little smarter. We can engage technology better to make food safer, be better at responding to outbreaks, as well as modernizing, recognizing that the way people are obtaining their food is changing as well. All right, should I move on? Should I just stop there?
Yeah, this is super helpful. And we're getting lots of great questions, and we'll be sure, Kevin, we can share a lot of these great resources and things that you're highlighting out to the attendees. But this was a great overview. I know I definitely learned a lot from both you and Ariel, and I think we want to keep this conversation going. So let's go ahead and jump into that fireside chat with Dana. And I'm also excited to have David Schutt join us. David is a senior legislative assistant for Congresswoman Julia Brownley. She represents the Ventura County in California, and he staffs her work on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and the House Natural Resources Committee. And he's worked in Congress for 7 years and has a Master in Public Policy from the George Washington University. And we're thrilled to have you here. So let's bring these speakers on the screen. Thanks, guys. Dana.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to dive into the chat part here. And just want to acknowledge there is so much to talk about with policy. So, we might jump around, but also probably not get to everything policy. So we can always have future discussions that dive in more deeply. I see a lot of questions on like specific California bills in the chat and all of that. But I want to start us off with David, who's joining us from Brownley's office. And I would just love to hear from you, David, like, what was the thinking behind introducing the Zero Waste Act? I mean, there's 50 other topics that you could have introduced a bill on. So tell us kind of what got you to introducing the Zero Food Waste Act. And while you're at it, we've had a couple questions around the infrastructure bill. and how this act might interplay, if anything, we'll get it, actually the two acts, once that gets to the House.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me on behalf of Congresswoman Brownley. And very happy to have been working with ReFED and Harvard and the other coalitional partners that you've been working with on our legislative efforts in Congress. So to answer the first part of your question, Congresswoman Brownley, as mentioned, is a member of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis in the House, and I staff her on that. And as many of you may be aware, last year the Select Committee put out a giant report, about 500 plus pages of all the actions that Congress needs to take, should take to address the various aspects of climate change, anything from electricity to transportation to agriculture, et cetera. But one area that Congresswoman Brownley felt we hadn't dived into much in the year plus that it took us to put together that report was the connection between climate and food. There's some things in there, obviously, through the agriculture sector, but it's something that in the 117th Congress, she has been very interested and dedicated to diving into deeper and learning more. And that's obviously a giant topic with lots of different ways that climate and food are connected, but one way is obviously food waste. If we're producing so much food that we know has takes a certain amount of emissions, et cetera, to produce, and if that's just going to landfills, first off, that's not a good use of our natural resources. But second, when it goes to landfills, as I know many people in this call knows, that produces far too much methane than is acceptable for us to reach our climate goals. So that was the lens that Congresswoman Brownley initially took into working on this. She has a very agriculture heavy district. And so we also encourage that we can really help farmers out with some of the work here, particularly on the compost side. Compost is a great tool to help farmers increase their yields, which is then, it makes for better soil. So it's both good for their yields, but also sequesters more carbon that way. So it can truly be a win-win in multiple directions. And then to answer the second part of your question of where do we go from here? What are we looking to do with these two bills? We are hopeful and working hard to try to get both of these included in some form into the budget reconciliation bill that Congress is set to start negotiating next. As you're all probably aware today, the Senate has passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but that's only the first step of what at least us on the House side and President Biden are looking to try to do in the larger world of climate and infrastructure investments. And that's where the second bill, this reconciliation bill, will come in, which we have a top line number of 3.5 trillion. So we're pushing hard to try to get both the grant programs, the EPA grant program in the Zero Food Waste Act and the USDA grant program in the Compost Act included as part of that effort. And so let me make a shameless plug we've got a lot of people on the call here. You're all probably from all different parts of the country. We'd love for you to reach out to your local representatives, both House and Senate, and say how important it is to you all to get this included, to get versions of these bills included into that. So happy to talk more about that, but I've been going on for a little bit, so I'll take a pause there.
Yeah, that's great, David. And actually, just sticking on this act for another moment here, there's been some questions about why two? Why not just one act?
Sure, yeah, so I can answer that quickly. Some of that is, as we were working all of this together, we actually were fortunate to be able to work with two separate but related coalitions that helped us work through the ideas. And because they are targeted at different agencies, it's also, that means they go on the House to different committees to handle each. And so being able to just focus on, when I'm talking to my colleagues in the House Agriculture Committee to talk about the Compost Act, when I'm talking to my Energy and Commerce colleagues talk about the Zero Food Waste Act, because that's EPA. But I mentioned for the Zero Food Waste Act, we're fortunate to work with ReFED and Harvard and World Wildlife Fund and NRDC, as well as a host of other collaborating groups. And then for the Compost Act, we worked with the newly formed U.S. Composting Infrastructure Coalition, as well as National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, to spearhead that. But obviously, as we said, these are very complementary efforts.
Super. Well, thank you, David. We're thrilled to have seen it introduced, so really appreciate all the work that your office has done to make that happen. Ariel, moving over to you. Let's talk a little bit. There's some questions about some specific state bills coming in, and I'm just curious. You presented a few different types of bills, the waste bans, date labeling, some school initiatives. Is there a particular type that you're seeing at the state level really kind of sail through or gain a lot of momentum?
That's a great question. Thanks, Dana. I don't know if I would say I've seen anything really sail through in too many states, but
maybe that's the wrong term. I don't know if there anything ever sails through anything.
Yeah, but I think there is a lot of bipartisan interest at the state level in food waste reduction in general. I will say, of the ones that I sort of touched on, I do think in certain states, there's a lot of interest in waste bans and recycling laws. And I actually misspoke. I think I said 5 states plus DC have implemented these. And I think it's actually now 8 states. So I had an old note from an older presentation, but I think it's 8 states plus DC have now implemented a waste ban or an organics recycling law, and 7 cities. So these are great because they can be done at the state level or at the local level. It's not something that can really be done at the federal level, at least right now, given the way that we typically regulate waste. But I think that's an area where we've seen a lot of excitement. And then I actually think there's a lot of movement around food waste reduction in K through 12 schools. So one thing we've seen in a lot of states is they've produced guidance on implementing share tables in schools. And so share tables are these tables where students can go and put their unopened food on tables, and then other students can go ahead and take it, or the food can then be taken and donated to a nonprofit. And we've seen a lot of that. And so I think that speaks to a really strong interest in reduction in K through 12 schools. So I think that having the sort of funding that the Zero Food Waste Act could potentially provide for those sorts of projects could then expand what's being done in schools to go towards things like composting programs and things like that. And then one other policy where we've seen a lot of interest that I didn't touch on during my presentation is liability protections for food donation. So we've seen a number of states pass bills expanding liability protections for food donation, and we've seen a lot of states introduce bills. And so just to give everyone a little bit more background, there is federal liability protection for food donation under the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act, and it provides pretty expansive food donation or protection for food donation, as long as the donor donates the food to a nonprofit in good faith, and then the nonprofit ultimately distributes the food to the ultimate recipient. And so the sorts of innovative policies that we're seeing at the state level are things like providing protection even if the food goes directly from certain donors who are already trained in safety to the ultimate recipient. So places like schools or restaurants who already have to undergo food safety training, or liability protection. So under the Bill Emerson Act, it has to be given, the food has to be given to the ultimate recipient for free. But we've seen some states introduce legislation that provides protection even where the food is given at a very low cost, just enough to cover the cost of administering and handling the food, which allows a lot of nonprofits to be more innovative in their models. And because it could cover some costs, it allows them to reach even more recipients. So those are some of the areas where I think we've seen a lot of interest and a lot of traction recently in terms of state level policy.
Yeah, I do kind of have a dream that someday this whole, if you sell food that was donated, and if you have food that was donated and you sell it at a reduced cost, the donor can still receive all the protection and tax benefits of donating it. I feel like that is just such a huge potential unlock that's been really hasn't gotten enough traction in my opinion yet.
Yeah.
But on that food rescue, food recovery side, Kevin, we have a couple questions coming in here let's see if you can answer for us about food safety rules that say when food touches the ground, it can no longer be donated or sold. And can you sort of clarify, is that true? And is that something that FDA has looked into at all? Although I think that may land in USDA's purview. So yeah, if you anything to say on that?
Sure. Well, there drops, stuff that is harvested from the ground can present food safety challenges. There have been outbreaks associated with food because often that's where it gets contaminated once it hits the ground. That's why there's rules like the juice HACCP rule. If you are harvesting food for processing into juice, you have to treat that. You can harvest drops. You just have to be sure that there is a treatment downstream that results in destruction of any disease-causing organisms that may be present. We've been working with individual sectors, like nut growers and orchard, fruit growers that on particular interventions that help reduce food safety risks. But yeah, there are certainly food safety concerns about drops, and that's again, it's finding the balance between how much protection is necessary to prevent foodborne illness versus how much are we losing to waste there. It's a difficult challenge.
I will say, interesting fact for everyone, in the UK, this has been true like year over year. They do like a survey of the public, and the public actually ranks food waste as a bigger concern than food safety, which is very different from the culture here in the US. So I think our model at ReFED shows that food safety is actually only responsible for a very small portion of food going to waste. But I sort of in my head have a feeling that we're not capturing all of the throws from food safety quite accurately there, and that it actually could be quite a bit larger. I will say, Kevin started to get to, and we cut him off so we could get to this discussion, but he started to get to this new era of food safety effort that's happening at the FDA. It's being led by Frankie Yanis, who happens to be a food waste champion in on his own right, who really led the industry to the voluntary guidelines around date labels that they've adopted. And Kevin, I'm wondering if you could just say a word about how people can engage in that whole new era of food safety process if they're interested.
Well, I guess, sure. Yeah, I think, again, the new era for smarter food safety, its purpose isn't spelled out to reduce food waste, although again, the perspective is changing, but it's again more about keeping food safe. But there are some opportunities. There's I quickly showed a screen with kind of 4 core elements, and the first element about involves enhanced traceability. There's a proposed rule. But unfortunately, the public comment period is done, and we are working on a revised rule to enhance how food is traced from producer to consumer. And that has the potential, again, it's mainly meant to ensure that when there's a problem, we can quickly if we identify a potential food safety problem, we can get the food off the shelves and without shutting down an entire industry. So that's an important, I think there's a lot of very positive food waste reduction things coming out of there, even if it's not the purpose of the actual rule. Getting engaged in rulemaking and stuff is a difficult prospect for individuals to get involved, but obviously almost every industry has always put forth considerable comment. We received thousands of comments on the traceability rule that was proposed. So you can go through the normal channels of public comment. You can also engage we're trying to hold more public forums for discussion under element 3 is the modernization of the retail system. There's a summit coming up on e-commerce October 19th through 21st that I encourage folks to register to participate in that. More information will be coming on how to register for that summit. That's an opportunity for voices to be heard across the spectrum for how we can ensure food safety while figuring out better distribution systems and figuring out how modernization of food distribution systems impacts food waste as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. I remember Frank's big aha moment around traceability and he has this story that he tells where when he was at Food Safety in Walmart and he threw this mango on the table and said, go figure out where this came from for me. And it took them 7 days. And then he said, once they implemented blockchain, it took 2 seconds or something. And the reduced waste that could result from not having to recall products, by being able to trace them right back to the source that quickly was this huge volume of potential avoided waste. So
absolutely,
that's just one of the many intersections. Great. Well, let's we have a couple questions on the Zero Food Waste Act and specifically how it intersects with food rescue. So one of those is, and David, maybe I'll send this to you first. Does the Zero Food Waste Act allow funds to be spent on operational programs such as food rescue operations? And also in tandem with that let's see. Well, let's just start there because I'm trying to understand the tandem question here. So yeah, can you use the funds for food rescue operations?
Yes, you can. So as Ariel laid out at the beginning when she was running through the bill, there are 3 main types of grant programs that someone can receive. And there's planning, there's measurement, and there's mitigation. And under mitigation, there's a series of different eligible projects that can qualify for a grant, and food rescue would be one of those. Ariel ran through a few of these, but rescue, recycling, meaning composting and otherwise, upcycling, as well as a reduction in the first place would all qualify as eligible projects.
Great. All right, thank you for that. It looks like we only have time for about one more question here. And I'm going to go because I see a few on date labeling. And so I will just mention on the policy side that I've heard, I know there's some interested groups for standardizing date labels. There have been 2 previous Congresses where a bill has been introduced. That hasn't happened in this one yet, but I've definitely heard some movement in different, on the coalition side of people really wanting to see that happen again. So who knows? But in the meantime, there's a question, Kevin, whether FDA is doing anything to work on standardizing date labels. You want to take that real quick?
Yeah, that's a tough one for us, but it's in the absence of legislation that directs us to develop regulations around the date labels. Date labels evolve as a voluntary practice, still a voluntary practice, mainly originated from the desire to not have were concerned that they're getting food that's beyond its quality, its good quality, and how can we stop food from being sold that isn't what people were expecting. So it had a different purpose. And so kind of trying to change a system that evolved voluntarily through regulatory intervention is not an easy undertaking, but just standardizing for consumers, standardizing what the labels say at least does help, and that's why we've gotten behind the voluntary industry standard that is seeking to simplify, just use best if used by if it's strictly a quality date, and used by if it's intended to convey information about safety, or if a date's very important where the quality or the performance really drops off after a date, you should be using used by. We've gotten back behind the voluntary industry standard for now. We'll see if legislation comes forward that requires us to have a more rigorous standard and a demonstration that a date is necessary and what that date needs to be.
Yeah, and I will say I know that FDA did send out a letter to like every food business that they have contact with, or however they do that, saying they support those voluntary guidelines. So that was one kind of easy-ish step that they could take to sort of voice support for that system. Right. Okay, last question in 30 seconds. What is your takeaway? You know, what is one thing people on the line, one thing you want them to take away from this conversation or do, starting with you, David?
Sure. So I think we have a real opportunity here in Congress. Congress is looking to make once in a generation or once in a decade investments in all aspects of our economy that have some connection to climate, and this is absolutely one that does. And so this is our moment. We have a couple of months here to try to make sure that we get these grant programs into the reconciliation package, and we don't want to miss that opportunity. So things are moving fast, but I highly encourage anyone on here to please reach out to your local representatives and senators to support our bills or support the concept in general. And I will. I know there's about 100 of you, but I'm going to throw my email in the chat, which I may live to regret. But I'm happy to talk with anyone at any time about these issues on behalf of my boss.
Okay, well, watch out. We have an active chat, so we might have an active set of contactors there. All right, Kevin, and then Ariel, we'll end with you.
I guess one thing we didn't really cover, well, the rescue and recovery, it's hard to get it exact on how much food you need to produce. And I think putting pressure on state, local, and federal governments to enact policy that encourages the food to have a second life. Recovery and donation of food that's surplus is important. We can do it. It can work together in keeping it safe and keeping it available to feed humans and animals. That's an achievable goal. And
awesome. We have a lot of food rescue groups on the line who I know agree with you on that. So that's a good one. And Ariel, bring us home here and then we'll take it to Angel.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just second everything that David and Kevin said. You know, stay informed and try and stay on top of there's a lot out there, but if there are particular issues that you really care about in the food waste space, make sure to show your support and make your voice heard, whether that's to local or state level representatives or to, you know, whoever's representing you in Congress. They definitely want to hear your voice. So I'd say just make that heard.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for participating, and Angel, bring us home.
Amazing. Thank you, Dana. And thank you, all our speakers. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. As a follow-up, we'll be sending out an email with some highlights from today's conversation. And we do have quite a few events coming up over the next several months. Our next one is in October. We're sending through a link to register for that event now. We hope you'll join us. And finally, if you liked today's event, we really encourage you to join our network